I will never forget my first trip to an Asian nation that I won't mention by name, but to describe the culture, it was a culture of honor, but it was an honor to a degree that was very uncomfortable for me, a foreigner, a visitor, and the level of honor that was extended toward me was something I was not used to. I don't know if I could ever be used to it. And as I watched the honor that was given to the pastors, it made me very uncomfortable. Honor is a biblical principle. Honor is deeply embedded in certain cultures, really in every culture to different degrees, but some cultures, it is sort of the bedrock. And yet, over honor is a dangerous thing. Honor is biblical. Honor is cultural. Over honor is destructive. It is deforming. And it is a dangerous situation to be in, especially as a pastor or a spiritual leader. And we'll see a text today, actually two scriptures we want to look at that deal with honor and over honor and how we should respond when we find ourselves in a situation of over honor. Even when we're in a culture that's different than our own, there are ways to respond without offending the culture and yet bringing protection to our own souls from the destruction that over honor can do to the heart. In Acts 14, beginning in verse 8, we see Paul and Barnabas have landed in Lystra, and there's this man who has been crippled from birth, and he gets miraculously healed. And as we watch the response to this, we see it as a picture of over honor, and we see how the apostles responded. So in verse 9, Paul looks at this guy who's never walked in his life. Everybody knew he was crippled, and he perceived, it says, it was an interesting phrase, he perceived that he had faith to be healed. And oftentimes, faith is a part of a healing miracle, and sometimes it doesn't seem to be. It's just a sovereign act of God, and sometimes Jesus would just heal, sometimes there was faith present, sometimes there wasn't. So that's a mystery we'll get to maybe in another talk. But this time, there's faith to be well. And so Paul, it says in verse 10, he speaks in a loud voice, and he says, stand upright on your feet. This is someone who has never walked, never stood, crippled from birth. And so it says he started walking. He stands up. Actually, it says he sprang up and started walking. So people see this miracle. It says when the crowds saw what Paul had done, they lifted their voices in their local language. And here's what they were saying, translated now. The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. So they are speaking to these two as if they're gods. They're calling them gods. They're thinking they are their gods, manifest there as humans. Not only was this crowd giving Paul and Barnabas a level of honor that should only be given to gods. Of course, they had gods. But not only that, but verse 13 says, the priest of Zeus. So now this is a religious leader, the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowd. So now the priest is even coming, ready to sacrifice to these men who preached the gospel and in the name of Jesus saw a healing happen, and they're being treated like gods. I see today all of the church pastors who maybe they haven't even had this kind of miraculous power and they're being treated like gods. How did these people respond? Verse 14, but when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they heard that they were being called gods. They heard that the priest was about to sacrifice to them in an act of worship. When they heard about it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd. They're crying out a message. But I want to look at this text right now and see how should we respond when we find ourselves being over-honored, when we find ourselves in a situation where we're getting credit to a level that only God should have this type of credit, that almost to a place of worship. What do we do? The first thing is there is urgency. We have this sense of urgency. We need to get out of this now. We need to end this now. A lot of people are running to fame. A lot of people are running to the applauding crowds. But what we see here is they rushed out. They didn't sit around and wait. They ran away. They rushed out. There was a sense of urgency. This level of over-honor is not healthy. It is not healthy for the gospel. It's not healthy for the leader's soul. And so we better have a sense of urgency when we find ourselves in a place of over-honor. Secondly, they brought clarity. As we say, they rushed out crying out in verse 15. They said this, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of nature with you, and we bring you good news." And so they brought clarity. We're not gods. We're human. We have the same nature, the same temptations, the same problems, we're just like you. And too often spiritual leaders are okay with people setting them apart and putting them on pedestals. We shouldn't be okay with that. There should be an urgency to diminish this over honor. There should be a clarity that we're just like you. There's not a difference. And then the next thing that we see, it says they brought the good news, and they said that they should turn from these vain things to serve the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and the Creator. And so how do we handle over honor? Number one, urgency. Get away from it. Number two, clarity of our own humanity and our own fallen nature. I think about that in John 3. In John the Baptist, when his disciples started getting a little bit jealous of Jesus and his disciples. And John's response was, when John's honor started being diminished a little bit, he fully embraced the honor going away. And he said this, "I'm not the Christ. I have been sent before him. He must increase, I must decrease." And so there should always be an honor increasing with Jesus, decreasing with us. And a lot of times in ministry contexts, it almost seems like the leader gets this level of honor that should only go to Jesus, and we need to deflect it and diminish it the way that John the Baptist did and the way that Paul and Barnabas did here. But this last one, so there's this sense of urgency. There's a message of clarity. But the third thing that they did, I threw three words into this. It was the message, the mission, the ministry. They got back to ministry. They got back on message. They got back on mission. What did they do? They started running away from this. They started clarifying, we're just humans. We're just witnesses. And then they said, we've got good news. And then they bring that good news. You turn away from these idols, their message, their ministry, their mission. They got back to the point. They got the light off of themselves onto Jesus, helping people focus away from us onto Him. We should be getting out of the limelight, decreasing so Jesus could increase. Now, at the end of this, he gets back now, this last verse in this text, verse 18. It says, "Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifices to them." Wow. They were still trying to worship and sacrifice. They were still calling these men gods. It says, even though they scarcely restrained them, but at least they tried. They tried to restrain them. There's something about crowds that want to put leaders, especially religious leaders, on pedestals. We have to do everything we can to restrain them from doing that, especially when there are miraculous things happening in the ministry. Now, just in closing, this idea, the danger of over-honor, especially for a spiritual leader. If we look back a couple of chapters, and I have to wonder if Paul was thinking back to this situation. It's the death of Herod at the end of chapter 12. He's giving this speech, and then in verse 22, after Herod, this wicked leader, gives this speech, it says, "The people were shouting, 'The voice of a God and not of a man.'" I would say that's a pretty good picture of over-honor. Similar to these other people calling Paul and Barnabas. And I wonder if Paul and Barnabas are knowing this story. Okay, wait a minute. Last time someone was called a god, it didn't really go too well. Look at this. Immediately, the people are saying, "The voice of a God, not of a man." Immediately, an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. I have to wonder if Paul, the moment they start saying, "Hey, you're like gods," wait a minute. We know what happened to Herod immediately. So there is an urgency. We better get out of this over-honor situation. We don't want to be eaten by worms here. Embracing over-honor. Embracing the kind of honor that's only for God is really not a good thing. But unfortunately, it happens all the time. So as a spiritual leader, remember this: next time you find yourself being put on a pedestal, the next time you find yourself receiving the kind of praise and honor that should only be given to God, don't embrace it, run from it. Get back on message, get back on mission, get back in the ministry of preaching the gospel and being a witness to Christ so that you can decrease and He can increase.